Hello! Glad you could make it. Were you aware that George Washington was an automaton? An automaton is a self-operating machine designed to follow a predetermined sequence of operations. The idea for the Washington automaton appeared to King George III in a dream. In the dream, King George had encountered a giant lady of the night while out for a stroll. Together the two of them journeyed for miles through a starlit field. In time they reached a mystical tree with a candle at its base. The seductress instructed the king to disrobe.
Show me what you're working with, Georgie boy.
The king removed everything but his boxers.
The boxers come off when you tell me your name.
The harlot whispered her name in George's ear.
Yankisha Doodle.
It was then that George realized the hooker was actually 3 American colonists piloting a huge mechanical dummy. The colonists laughed at the mortified monarch as he stood there shielding his royal Tenenbaums. When George awoke, he was infuriated yet enlightened by his imbroglio with the Trojan whore. He hired the 2 best inventors in London to construct a robotic colonist that would be loyal to the British.
Sure, whatever, Your Majesty.
The inventors spent several months creating a self-regulating mechanical man out of clock parts and real human tissue.
I like scones.
Like many first drafts, there were still some tweaks to be made. For the next 2.5 years, the inventors worked tirelessly to perfect the automaton.
I like tea-kettles.
Finally, in the year 1771, the craftsmen summoned the king to the royal courtyard to observe the finished product. King George was overcome with emotion at the sight of the mechanical spy. He decided he would spend some time bonding with the machine before sending it to America to be a sleeper agent.
So, like, when are we getting paid?
Together he and the robot journeyed 4 miles through a starlit field, just like in the king's dream. In time they reached a mystical tree that smelled like cherries. King George dressed up the automaton in his wife's clothes and reenacted the pottery scene from the movie Ghost.
Just let the clay slide between your fingers.
Unbeknownst to the king, the tree smelled like cherries because his wife was standing behind it eating a Danish. Racked with envy, the king's wife resolved to sabotage the robot before its trip overseas. That night, while the sexually confused king slept, Charlotte hatched her plan for revenge. She paid the two inventors a generous sum to reprogram the robot to hate her husband.
Nigel, look! Money!
The inventors unzipped the machine's back and programmed it to resent authority. Unfortunately, the newly coded colonists resented authority a little too much. The three saboteurs stared in stunned silence as the artificial assassin sped away across the Atlantic like David Hasselhoff in the SpongeBob movie. Immediately, the king's widow commissioned the construction of a decoy George III to rule in his stead.
Hey, I'm the King of England.
But the process was slow going, and the king's absence from the public eye had not gone unnoticed.
Where's George? Maybe he's dead.
Charlotte tried her best to assure the populace that her husband was alive and well.
I'm feeling simply splendid.
A parrot was concealed inside the king's skull to help foster the illusion that he was speaking.
My wife is out of my league. Bruh!
Everything was going swimmingly until the parrot took a shit in the king's mouth during a performance of Shakespeare's Macbeth. The combined stench of bodily decay and parrot shit ultimately forced the corpse of George III to be retired from its interim role as ruler of Britain. With the king due to give a speech the next day, and only the head of his robot doppelganger complete, the inventors had no choice but to affix the cranium to the body of an automated prostitute.
My eyes are up here.
Thankfully, the automaton's voluptuous anatomy was easily covered by the king's billowy regalia.
Looking good, George.
Regrettably, this also meant that the inventors were of no further use to the paranoid Charlotte. Meanwhile, the Washington automaton had been accepted into colonial society, and had become a vocal critic of the British Parliament. It had also gotten married to a woman named Martha Custis, with whom it shared no children, because robots don't jizz.
Well, Florida and Alaska, though.
Martha Custis did, however, have several children from a previous marriage, one of which would go on to supply her with multiple grandchildren.
You're welcome.
It is unknown whether or not Martha ever knew that her husband was an android, but it is rumored that she became suspicious during their honeymoon on account of George's penis being a screwdriver. Another popular theory contends that Martha learned of her husband's true nature through an extradition order detailing his murder of King George. The order was likely forged by Charlotte, who had somehow overlooked the fact that dead kings don't generally write letters.
You calling me stupid?
Many historians believe that Martha attempted to extort hush money from the crown, after deducing that an impostor had replaced the flesh and blood King George. Charlotte would later describe Martha as a greedy sundial-nosed bitch in her autobiography. If in fact the Washingtons knew that Charlotte was now ruling Britain by proxy, it stands to reason that the American Revolution was a direct response to the illegitimate reign shared by her and her puppet.
You've no right to tax us. You're a robot.
Look who's talking.
In the end, Charlotte and her hastily assembled robot spouse would prove to be no match against the superior build quality of the Washington automaton.
General, there's a loose screw in the frame of the boat.
Quickly, Jonathan, take my penis.
King George's well-documented descent into madness in the latter half of his life was likely the consequence of infrequent tune-ups and maintenance checks performed by the tech-illiterate Charlotte.
I am Optimus Prime.
Washington, of course, would wind up serving 2 terms as the first president of the United States, following the defeat of the silly British. In his twilight years, the aging android would develop an unhealthy obsession with owning exotic pets, the likes of which would soon facilitate his doom. On December 14, 1799, a housemaid at Washington's Mount Vernon estate discovered a pile of the ex-president's clothes, lying next to a guilty-looking capybara. The plantation staff urged Martha to have the animal dissected in order to verify that it had eaten George, but Mrs. Washington wouldn't hear of it.
George loved his animals, including this one.
In order to protect the capybara, a phony story was released to the press alleging that George had died from breathing trouble following prolonged exposure to a cold rain. Of course, this story did not fool Charlotte, who knew full well that the Washington automaton had never breathed a day in its life.
Nice try, you lying little wankstains.
Luckily for the Washingtons, Charlotte would never find the time to meddle any further in their affairs, since babysitting the Mad King had become a full-time gig.
What would you do for a Klondike bar?
Well, there you go. That's the story of George Screwdriver Dick Washington. Anything else you wanna ask me while I'm here?
Yeah. You gonna cite your sources for all that dumbass bullshit?
Security. And how did you enjoy the presentation, Mr. Onion?